I said it like it was nothing, like a joke I'd told 100 times before and didn't even need to believe anymore for it to land. No woman would ever put up with me. That's what I said, out loud, on a porch, on an ordinary Tuesday. And a woman answered before either one of us could stop her. My name is Wyatt Cole, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of man people describe with a shrug and a change of subject. 42 years old, a carpenter by trade, the guy Cedar Hollow, Georgia calls when a summer storm rips a porch clean off its posts or splits a roof beam down the middle. I like the smell of cut pine in July heat and the small, honest click of a level finally sitting true. I don't say much, because the things I used to say when I was drinking cost me every single thing I ever had worth keeping, and somewhere along the way, I learned it was safer to keep my mouth shut and my hands busy instead. I've been sober 10 years now. One day stacked carefully on top of another, until, without my really noticing, it turned into a decade. Most nights, I still counted anyway, quietly, like it might slip out from under me if I stopped paying attention. A town the size of Cedar Hollow doesn't forget a man like the one I used to be, and honestly, some part of me doesn't think it should. They remember the version of Wyatt who missed his own cousin's wedding because he was passed out in the bed of his truck behind the feed store. They remember the wife who packed a bag while he was too far gone even to notice she was leaving him. That man has been 10 years dead, buried under every hard, sober morning I clawed my way through to get here, but Cedar Hollow keeps his photograph hanging on the wall the same way it keeps mine, right next to it, like they're the same person. I made my peace a long time ago with being looked at twice in the grocery store line. What I never made peace with, not once in 10 years, is the idea that somebody could actually look straight past all of that and choose to stay anyway. That's the joke I made standing on Claire Bennett's half-finished porch on a Tuesday night in June, sawdust still in my hair, her coffee going cold and untouched on the railing between us. I said it the way I always do, to get out ahead of the silence before the silence could get out ahead of me, so the uncomfortable laugh could come and go quickly and nobody would have to sit inside it too long. Claire didn't laugh. She looked at me like I'd said something that mattered a great deal more than I'd ever intended it to, and she said 2 words, "I would," before either of us had half a second to take them back. I didn't know it yet, standing there with a hammer still loose in my hand, but those 2 words were about to either save the rest of my life or tear it wide open all over again, and for the first time in 10 years, I honestly had no idea which one it would be. If a story like this one means something to you, take a second and hit subscribe, because you are going to want to see how this one ends. I didn't bring it up again the next morning, and neither did she. I showed up at 8 sharp like always, toolbox in one hand and a paper sack of nails in the other, boots still damp from the dew on her front lawn, and Claire handed me a mug of coffee. Like the night before hadn't happened at all, like 2 words hadn't quietly rearranged something between us that I still didn't have a name for. We worked the way we always worked, careful and a little too polite. I measured boards along the new joists while she watered the ferns hanging off what was left of the porch railing, and for a few hours it was almost easy to pretend I'd imagined the whole thing, that grief and sawdust and a long day had just made me hear what some lonely, half-starved part of me had wanted to hear. I leaned on the work harder than usual that morning, on the plain, honest math of a level and a chalk line, because a plumb board never once lied to me the way my own head could, and I had learned to trust that kind of quiet a long time back, during the years when nothing else in my life could be trusted at all. Except I kept showing up earlier than the job actually required, and I kept finding reasons that sounded better than the truth. I told myself the Georgia heat gets unbearable by noon this time of year, that starting at 7 made more sense than 8 ever would, and I said it to my own reflection in the truck mirror with a perfectly straight face, even though I knew better the entire drive over. Claire started leaving a second mug out on the porch railing before I'd even knocked on the doorframe to let her know I'd arrived, steam still curling off the top of it, like she'd timed it to my tires on the gravel. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that doesn't mean anything on its own, until one morning you realize you've quietly started organizing your whole week around it without ever once deciding to. That was the whole shape of that summer, small and quiet and stacking up behind my back while I told myself nothing in particular was happening, that a man could not be blamed for looking forward to a cup of coffee that somebody else had bothered to pour for him. Claire Bennett is 38 years old, and she runs the flower and coffee counter on Main Street that used to belong to her mother before her, the kind of shop where the bell over the door has rung the exact same way for 30 years and the regulars still order by first name. She buried her husband Daniel 3 winters back, after his heart gave out one January morning in the parking lot of the very hardware store where I still buy my nails and my wood screws, a coincidence neither of us has ever said out loud, but both of us have clearly noticed. She doesn't bring him up unless she wants to, and when she does, her voice doesn't break so much as it drops low and careful, like she's carrying something fragile across a room and doesn't trust her own hands not to spill it. She hired me back in May, after a spring storm peeled her porch clean off its foundation like it weighed nothing at all, and by the middle of June I understood that porch wasn't the only thing around her that had been left standing half-finished. I noticed that the very first day I came to give her an estimate, and it settled in me and never left. In the evenings, once the light turned orange over the pine tops and the cicadas started up their racket behind her house, the two of us would sit together on the bare porch steps, because there wasn't a finished porch yet, worth sitting on properly, and we'd talk about nothing that mattered, and somehow everything that did. She told me about Daniel's terrible taste in gospel music, and the way he used to sing off-key in the truck on purpose just to make her laugh on the drive to church. I told her, in careful, rationed pieces, about the years I don't like to talk about out loud, the ones that cost me a marriage and very nearly cost me the rest of my life along with it. She never once flinched at any of it, not even the ugliest parts. She never looked at me the way the rest of Cedar Hollow does, like I was a story they'd already heard the ending to a long time ago and didn't need to hear again. There was a kind of mercy in that I hadn't expected from anybody, let alone a widow with plenty of her own good reasons to be careful about who she let sit close to her on a quiet porch step once the sun went down. It was Claire's idea, not mine, to invite me to the church harvest supper at the end of September, a good 3 months out still, but she said it like it was already decided, already written down somewhere, like of course I would be standing there beside her at a folding table in the fellowship hall with a paper plate of ham and butter beans, like there wasn't a single reason on God's earth I shouldn't be. I told her I'd think it over, same as I do with most things I want too badly. Truth is, I'd already said yes inside my own head before she'd even finished the sentence, and that scared me a good deal more than any Georgia thunderstorm ever had. I drove home that night going the long way around, past the water tower and the closed feed store, just to have a few extra minutes to sit with the idea of a folding table and a paper plate, and my name spoken next to hers in front of the whole congregation, in front of people who had known both versions of me and would be watching close to see which one showed up. Without her asking, and without telling her a word about it, I started building Claire a rocking chair. I used scrap white oak left over from a job I'd done outside Macon that spring, sanding it smooth in my own garage after supper, one slat at a time, night after night. Radio turned low, because I didn't know any other way to tell her I'd noticed the porch swing chain bolted to nothing but empty air where a hook used to be. I wanted her to have somewhere steady to sit once the whole porch was finally finished, something built specifically for her weight and her height and nobody else's. I didn't tell her I was building it. I didn't have the first idea how to explain why I needed to, only that I did. Some nights, I would stand back under the garage light and run my thumb along a joint until it satisfied me, thinking about the exact spot on her porch where it would sit once the boards were down, picturing her sitting in it on some ordinary evening long after I was done working for her, whether or not I was still around to see it. Small gestures piled up between us that summer, the way sawdust piles up on a job site. Quiet, easy to overlook unless you're the one sweeping the floor at the end of the day. She started keeping a second coffee mug on the shelf above the sink, the plain blue one with the chipped handle that nobody else in town would have bothered keeping, and without either of us saying it out loud, it became mine and only mine. I started fixing things around her house that had nothing to do with the porch contract at all. A cabinet door that stuck every August in the humidity. A fence gate that dragged a rut in the dirt every time it swung open, because leaving at the end of the day had started to feel harder than staying, and I didn't want to look too closely at what exactly that meant about me. Nobody paid me to fix that gate, and nobody asked me to. I just could not stand the sound it made anymore, and I noticed I had started thinking about her house the same way a man thinks about his own, checking the gutters after a hard rain, listening for a loose shutter in the wind without meaning to. Neither of us ever said the word that was sitting right there between the coffee cups and the half-built rocking chair, plain as day, if either one of us had the courage to name it out loud. I told myself it was gratitude, her way of thanking a broken-down carpenter for fixing what a storm had broken free. I told myself a lot of comfortable, convenient things that summer, the kind a man tells himself so he can keep showing up without having to admit why. But some nights, driving home past the little white Baptist church with my windows rolled down and the radio off, I'd catch myself wondering exactly what Claire Bennett and I were quietly building out there on that half-finished porch, and whether either one of us had the nerve to call it by its real name before somebody else came along and decided to name it for us instead. I did not have an answer that summer, and neither, I suspect, did she, and maybe that was the safest place either of us knew how to stand. By the middle of July, the porch had real bones again, joists set, decking half laid, and Claire started bringing supper out on a tray instead of letting me eat alone in my truck the way I usually did on a job. We ate fried okra and cornbread sitting on upturned buckets because there was nowhere proper to sit yet, and somewhere in the middle of that, without deciding to, I told her about the sobriety chip I have carried in my front pocket every single day for 10 years, the little bronze coin worn smooth on one side from my thumb, rubbing it in parking lots and waiting rooms, and, more than once, standing outside a bar I did not go into. I have never shown that chip to anyone besides my sponsor. Claire held it in her open palm like it weighed something, turned it once in the porch light, and handed it back to me without a single word of pity in her face, which was exactly the right thing to do. Telling her about the chip loosened something else in me, and over the next few evenings the whole story came out in pieces, not because she pushed for it, but because she made room for it without flinching. I told her about the year I lost my job at the mill for showing up smelling like a distillery, the year my own mother stopped answering her phone when my number came up, the morning Michelle left with 2 suitcases while I lay on the living room floor too far gone to stop her or even fully understand what was happening. Claire listened the way some people pray, quiet and completely still, and when I finished, she said only that the man sitting on her porch steps was clearly not the man in that story, and she said it like a fact rather than a kindness, which is the only way I have ever been able to believe anything good said about me. I sat there a long moment with the empty plate on my knee, waiting for the old shame to rise up the way it always had, and it never came. That absence scared me almost as much as the story itself, because I had built my whole self-image around being found out eventually. That kind of honesty disarmed me more thoroughly than any bottle ever managed to fill me up. I have spent 10 years building a life out of small, careful habits, meetings on Tuesday nights, a sponsor named Harlan who calls every Sunday whether I answer or not, a chip in my pocket that I touch without thinking when a job goes bad or a bill comes due. None of that ever felt like enough to outweigh the man I used to be in this town's memory. Sitting across from Claire on an unfinished porch, cornbread crumbs on a paper plate between us, it felt, for the first time in a decade, like maybe it actually could be. I did not say that out loud to Claire, not that night, but I remember looking at the half-laid decking under our feet and thinking that a man could build his whole life back the same slow way, board by board, if somebody was willing to sit with him while the boards went down, one nail at a time, without rushing him towards some finished version of himself he was not ready to be yet. It was around then that Michelle Reyes came back to Cedar Hollow, though nobody warned me first, which is how these things always seem to happen in a town this size. Her father had passed that spring, and she had come back to put his house on the market, driving a car nicer than anything that has ever been parked on Main Street. Her husband, Grant Prescott's name printed on a real estate sign stuck in half the yards between here and the county line, a man I had only ever seen in a framed photograph on the back of a business card. I ran into her at the grocery store on a Thursday, reaching for the same shelf of coffee filters, and for one long second neither of us said a word. 10 years compressed down into the space between two carts. She had cut her hair shorter and dressed like the county line meant something different to her now, and I stood there holding a can of coffee filters like a man caught somewhere he had no business being caught. She looked good. Rich good. Rested good. The kind of good that comes from never having to wonder if the lights would stay on. She smiled at me the way you smile at an old dog that used to bite, careful and a little amused, and said it was good to see me looking well, that she had heard I was still around, still doing the porch work, still keeping busy. There was nothing in the words themselves a stranger could object to. It was everything underneath them that put a chill straight through me. The particular way she said still, like she was marking a box on a form she had already filled out about who I was and always would be. I said something polite back, told her I was sorry about her father, and got out of that store faster than I have moved in years, my heart going harder than it had any right to over a woman who had not crossed my mind in longer than I liked to admit, though something in the back of my head already knew a 5-minute run-in over coffee filters was not going to be the last I saw of her that summer. Word travels through Cedar Hollow faster than weather does, and within a week I heard, second-hand, from Harlan of all people, that Michelle had been telling people at the beauty shop she was relieved to see I had cleaned myself up, at least for now. The way she always used to say it back when cleaned up was a temporary condition and not a decade-long fact. I told myself it did not matter what Michelle Reyes said over a shampoo bowl. I told myself that walking home from the store, the coffee filters forgotten on the passenger seat, my hands not quite steady on the wheel, for reasons that had nothing to do with the road. Harlan told me not to give it another thought, that Michelle Reyes had never once in her life said a kind word without wanting something back for it. But Harlan had not spent 10 years watching this town decide, over and over, exactly which version of me it wanted to believe. Claire noticed something had shifted in me before I said a word about it, the way she seemed to notice most things about me that I would rather have kept hidden. She asked, straight out, over coffee on the half-finished porch, whether something was wrong, and I told her, as plainly as I could manage, that my ex-wife was back in town selling her father's house. I did not tell her everything Michelle had been saying. I did not yet understand how much that omission was going to cost me later, standing in front of half the county with no good way to explain why I had not warned her sooner. At the time, it felt like protecting her from something small and already finished. I had no idea yet how wrong that instinct would turn out to be, or how much easier the whole thing might have gone if I had simply told her everything that first evening instead of letting her hear it later from a room full of strangers. Claire only nodded and reached over and set her hand flat against mine on the porch rail, not saying it was fine, not promising anything foolish, just letting the weight of her palm say what words might have gotten wrong. It should have felt like comfort. Instead, driving home that night, I could not shake the feeling that something was coming toward Cedar Hollow the way a storm comes toward a porch that has only just been rebuilt, slow enough to see from a distance, and entirely too fast to stop once it finally arrived. I touched the chip in my pocket the whole way home, the way I always do when the ground under me feels uncertain, and for the first time in a long while, it did not settle me the way it usually does, and I drove the rest of the way home with my window down and my jaw tight, wondering exactly how many people in Cedar Hollow Michelle had already gotten to before I even knew she was back. The Cedar Hollow Baptist Harvest Supper happens the same way every year. Folding tables in the fellowship hall, casserole dishes lined up under a hand-lettered banner that has hung there since before I was born, half the county packed shoulder to shoulder with paper plates of ham and butter beans, and somebody's grandmother's banana pudding. Claire had asked me to come as her guest weeks earlier, and I had said yes with more nerve than I usually carry into a crowded room full of people who knew my whole history by heart. I wore a clean shirt I had ironed twice. I combed my hair in the truck mirror longer than any grown man should. I told myself, the whole drive over with the windows down and the radio off, that whatever Michelle Reyes had been whispering around town that summer could not possibly follow me into a church basement full of people who had watched me grow up from a boy into whatever I had become. I was wrong about that, and I found out exactly how wrong within the first 20 minutes of walking through the door. Michelle came in on Grant Prescott's arm, dressed sharper than anybody at a covered dish supper has any earthly business being dressed, gold at her wrists, a smile already fixed in place before she had even found me in the crowd. She made her way straight toward the dessert table, where Claire and I were standing with 2 plates of pecan pie, weaving between folding chairs like she still owned every square foot of that fellowship hall. Grant trailed a step behind her, silent, the way rich men often are in rooms where their money has not yet been asked to do any talking. He had the look of a man who had learned long ago it was easier to let his wife handle a room than to try handling it himself, and he stood there now with his hands in his pockets, watching her work the crowd the same practiced way she must have worked plenty of rooms before this one. She said it was so good to see old friends catching up after all these years, and she said it loud, loud enough for the tables nearest us to catch every single word over the gospel quartet tuning up in the corner. Then, still smiling that same fixed smile, she turned to Claire and said she hoped somebody had been honest with her about Wyatt's history, because relapse, in her experience, has a way of hiding itself real well right up until the morning it does not hide anymore. The fellowship hall went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when it senses a story about to finish playing itself out. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Somebody's chair scraped the linoleum, and nobody moved to explain it. A woman 2 tables over leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind a napkin, and I watched the whisper travel outward from her the way ripples travel out from a stone dropped in still water, table to table, until half the fellowship hall was looking at me instead of their plates. Claire's hand found mine under the edge of the dessert table, steady as a level, but I felt my own pulse hammering loud enough in my ears to drown out the quartet entirely. Michelle kept going, gentle as a blade, saying she had heard from more than one person in town that I had already slipped once already this summer, that she recognized every sign because she had lived through 6 long years of exactly this, and that she only wanted to spare a kind woman like Claire the same heartbreak she herself had barely survived. She even named a date, casual as anything, a Thursday 2 weeks back, when I had supposedly been seen stumbling out of a bar on the county road, a detail specific enough, delivered calm enough, that half the room turned to look at me, waiting for a denial. The way a jury waits on a man who has already been convicted once before and is not owed the benefit of the doubt a second time. None of it was true. Not one single word. I had been at a Tuesday night meeting that whole week, same as every week for 10 years running. On that particular Thursday, I had been 30 miles away picking up lumber in Macon, with a receipt to prove it folded in my truck's glove box. It did not matter. A folded receipt cannot talk over a room, and I had not thought to bring it to a supper. I opened my mouth to say exactly that, and nothing clean came out. 10 years of proof sat useless in my pocket, while 30 years of this town's memory did all the talking in my place, and for one long, suspended second, standing under that hand-lettered banner, with pecan pie going warm and forgotten in my hand, I felt the old shame rise up the exact same way it used to rise, right before I reached for a drink, quick and hot and convincing, and some small, cowardly corner of me actually wondered if Michelle Reyes had been right about who I was from the very beginning. Claire's fingers tightened around mine, and I felt her draw a breath beside me, the kind a person draws right before they say something that cannot be taken back once it is said. The whole fellowship hall seemed to lean in half an inch, waiting on her the same way they had just been waiting on me, and I stood there holding a plate of pecan pie, with no idea whether the next words spoken out loud in that room were going to save what Claire and I had built, or finish what Michelle Reyes had clearly come there to do. Claire did not raise her voice. She set her plate down on the dessert table, slow and deliberate, and told Michelle that she happened to have something in her car that might interest everybody standing there listening so closely, and she walked out to the parking lot without waiting for an answer, her heels loud on the fellowship hall linoleum in the total silence she left behind her. She came back 2 minutes later, carrying a shoebox I had never once seen in my life, tied shut with a length of kitchen twine, and set it down on the dessert table next to the pecan pie like it had always belonged there. I recognized the twine before I recognized the box, the same rough kitchen string Claire used to tie up bundles of dried lavender for the shop, and for one confused second, I could not understand what any of that had to do with the woman standing across from me, with her arms folded and her smile finally starting to slip. Inside were 11 letters, every one of them in my own handwriting, mailed to Michelle across the 6 months after she left me 10 years back. Letters I had written from a rented room above the hardware store, begging her to give me 90 days to get sober before she signed the divorce papers. Letters she had never once answered. Claire explained, plain as reading a grocery list, that Daniel's mother had kept them, that Daniel's mother had been Michelle's own aunt, that the letters had passed through the family for a decade until Claire found the box while helping clear out the estate that spring, and recognized my handwriting on the very first envelope before she had even opened it. She told me later she almost threw the box out without looking twice, and that something, she still could not say exactly what, made her sit down on the floor of that dusty attic and read every single letter twice before she ever said a word to me about what she had found. Pastor Ellis, who had married Wyatt and Michelle himself 11 years before and stood beside me at that same church the whole ugly year afterward, stepped forward from the crowd without anybody asking him to. He said, in the voice he uses from the pulpit, that he remembered the exact week those letters were sent, remembered counseling a young man who could not understand why his own wife would not answer his calls while he was fighting for his life, and that he had never once, in 10 years since, seen that man take a single drink, and that he would say so under oath in a courthouse if anybody in that room needed him to, though he suspected, looking around at the faces gathered there, that nobody was going to need him to say it twice. Michelle's face went the color of chalk. She reached for something to say and came up with nothing, because there is no answer to 11 letters and a pastor's memory and a decade of Tuesday night meetings all landing on a dessert table at the same time. The room that had leaned toward me 20 minutes earlier now turned, slow and complete, until every eye in that fellowship hall was fixed on her instead, and for the first time in 10 years, I watched somebody else wear the look I had spent a decade learning to live inside. I reached into my pocket and set my bronze chip down next to the shoebox, 10 years etched into one small worn coin, and told the room, in a voice steadier than I expected to find, that I had earned every single day on that chip the hard way, and I was not ashamed of one of them anymore. Grant Prescott took his wife by the elbow and walked her out through the fellowship hall doors without another word, and nobody in that room made the smallest move to stop them. Claire took my hand again in front of everybody this time, no hiding it under a table, and the fellowship hall broke into the kind of low, relieved murmur a room makes when it realizes it almost believed the wrong story. I did not know yet exactly what came next for the two of us, standing there in front of half of Cedar Hollow with a shoebox of old letters between us. But for the first time since Michelle Reyes had walked back into town, I let myself believe that whatever it was going to be good. A year has passed since that night in the fellowship hall, and Claire's porch is finished now, every board sanded and sealed, the rocking chair sitting exactly where I always pictured it sitting, right beside the swing I finally hung properly on a rebuilt hook that will hold through any storm Georgia decides to send our way. We got married this past spring on that same porch, folding chairs borrowed from the same church basement where Michelle Reyes once tried to tell a room full of our neighbors who I really was. Pastor Ellis did the honors himself, and half of Cedar Hollow came out to watch, the same people who had leaned in 20 minutes early that harvest supper now leaning in again for an entirely different reason. Harlan stood up at the reception and told the room he had sponsored a lot of men over the years, and that not one had ever done the work quite the way I had, quietly, without expecting a soul to notice, and I sat holding Claire's hand under the table, thinking some words land different once earned. I still carry the bronze chip in my front pocket every single day, worn smoother now than it has ever been, and beside it these days sits a second one, marked 11 years instead of 10, the two of them riding together like proof that a man can keep adding good days on top of good days for as long as he is willing to keep showing up for them. Claire keeps the shoebox of old letters on a shelf in our bedroom closet, twine and all, not hidden away, but not displayed either, just kept, the way you keep the one photograph that reminds you exactly how close you came to losing everything before you ever got to keep it. Some evenings, when the porch light is on and the cicadas are going strong behind the house, she pulls the box down anyway and reads one of the letters out loud to me, and I hardly recognize the man who wrote them, desperate and half drowning, begging for a 90 days he never got, though I am grateful now, in a way I could not have explained back then, that things worked out exactly the way they eventually did. Michelle Reyes sold her father's house that same fall and has not set foot in Cedar Hollow since, and I find I do not think about her nearly as often as I once feared I might. What I think about instead is the exact sound Claire's heels made crossing that fellowship hall floor, and the particular way an entire room can turn itself around once somebody finally hands it the truth instead of the easier story. I think about how close I came, standing under that banner with pie going cold in my hand, to believing the worst version of myself simply because somebody said it loud enough and confident enough in front of enough people. It taught me something I carry around now almost as often as I carry that chip, that the loudest voice in a room is not always the truest one, and that the people worth keeping close are the ones who go quiet and steady instead of loud, and go looking for the proof instead of just believing whichever story arrives first. If you have ever had somebody decide, without asking you, exactly who you are and exactly who you will always be, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below, what it took for you to prove them wrong, or who it was that finally looked straight at the worst chapter of your story and refused, flat out, to believe it was the whole book you had left to write. I used to believe love worth having meant finding somebody who never asked who you used to be, somebody who left the past sealed up and unopened like a box nobody was ever allowed to reach for. I know better now. Love worth keeping was never about being spared that question. It is about finding the one person who reaches for the box anyway, reads every letter twice, and chooses, in front of God and half the county if it comes to that, to stay.